Okay, we are back and we are talking about tissues. So, with tissues, if we remember, tissues are made up of cells, right? If we look back into chapter one, we were thinking about the human body and organizing it in, the smallest molecule to the actual organismal, individual. So, we had that chemical level that had the ions, the atoms, and the molecules, and then all of that got grouped together, and then we had the cells, which again were the smallest living organ level of organization, and then we put a bunch of cells together, and they're all going to have similar function, and they're going to compose a tissue. Okay, so here we are. What makes up a tissue? Again, it's a population of cells, and these cells are performing a similar function, but they're also going to have a similar structure. All right. Now, the second thing that makes up a tissue that we haven't really discussed yet is something called the extracellular matrix. And this is oftentimes abbreviated with ECM. So we need to understand ECM, extracellular matrix. Okay. And this is sort of just like a surrounding material. I'll be honest with you, it's mostly water. Okay. So if we're looking at this image here, this is ECM. This is the extracellular matrix. And we have basically two major components. We have ground substance, which again, mostly water, but there are some like glycosaminoglycan, GAGs, proteoglycans, different proteins, glycoproteins, right? Um, that's all going to be composed of the ground substance. Things that we can actually see when we look at tissue preps are protein fibers. This is also another component of the ECM. There are three different types of protein fibers: collagen, reticular, and elastic, and we'll talk about them more as they come up, okay? But those are ground substance and protein fibers. Those are the two main components of the extracellular matrix. Okay, now the reason I'm bringing this up in the beginning is because I just think it's important to understand the composition of tissue. Okay, however, in some of these tissues, we do not see any extracellular matrix. Okay, it's actually not even there. All right, so it's important to keep in mind what extracellular matrix is. And that may help you narrow down your choices when you are, tasked in identifying these different tissue preps. So, there are 4 different types of tissues. Okay? So, remember, we have that organization, the chemical level, to the cells, to the tissues, and that's where we are right now. Okay? Eventually, we will get into the organs that make up the organ systems, but right now we got to talk about the tissues. So, again, there are 4 different types of tissue. And then within each type, there's, let me see, I think in epithelial tissue, there's about 9 tissues. Connective tissues, I think there's 13. Muscular tissue, 3. Nervous tissue, just 1. Okay. We'll get into those specifics later on. All right. For right now, let's just look at the 4 main types and think about their function. Okay. Epithelial tissue. This is where we're going to start when we get into the specifics of these tissue types. Epithelial tissue is typically seen covering or lining the surfaces of the body. It's also going to line internal passageways and chambers. And it also produces glandular secretions. Connective tissue. Connective tissue, I will say, is probably the hardest to identify in my personal opinion. But with connective tissue, we're looking at tissues that will provide structural support. They can fill internal spaces. They can store energy. And if we look over here, we can see that connective tissue also performs in protecting different organs, protecting different tissues. Okay. Muscular tissue, we spend a lot of time on muscular tissue when we get into the actual muscle unit. So we don't spend too much time here in this chapter, but we will introduce it. Basically, muscle tissue is there to produce contractions that produce body movements in some sort of way. And then we have nervous tissue, okay? It really shouldn't be nerve tissue, it is nervous tissue, okay? So nervous tissue, this is going to be, looking at the nervous system. So again, we'll talk more about the nervous tissue when we get into the nervous system unit. We will introduce it a little bit though later on. But main function, conducting electrical impulses, right? And then also, we have that transmission, right? So it picks up signals, processes the signals, and then transmit said signals, okay? So it does carry a lot of information throughout the body. Okay, so it's important to understand that these are the four main types and that they do get broken down into subcategories. We do need to know the main functions here, but I think that it's important to note the extracellular matrix component. Okay, in epithelial tissue, there's little to no extracellular matrix. Okay, so if there's no extracellular matrix, we're just looking at cells. With connective tissue, there's an abundant amount. Okay, there's so much extracellular matrix. So with connective tissue, you're not so much looking at a lot of cells, you're more so looking at the protein fibers, okay, of the extracellular matrix. So let's show an example. So here we have a comparison between epithelial and connective tissue. Okay, here, remember, epithelial tissue has little to no ECM. So what's left? A tissue is made of cells and ECM. If there's no ECM, we're just looking at cells. So with epithelial tissue, you're really just going to be focusing on the cells, and they're usually going to be really compact. Okay, so you'll see these compact cells. That is what we're seeing here. I can identify that this is a cell because we can see that one one organelle of the nucleus here inside that cell. Okay. And then over here with the connective tissue, we have cells, they're scattered around. We have, again, an abundant amount of extracellular matrix. So really, we're not focusing on the cells anymore. We're focusing on the extracellular matrix. We can't identify ground substance because it's mostly water, but we can identify protein fibers. Okay, so with connective tissue, yeah, we can see a cell, and I know it's a cell because I can see the nucleus, but really that's not going to help us identify the tissue or anything. What we want to focus on are the protein fibers. Okay,